Good evening, everyone. My name is Zethu Mkhize, Director for the Center for the Advancement of Social Impact and Transformation. We are gathered in this fashion to celebrate Africa Day as part of the university's SU calendar of engagement. Africa Day is celebrated to commemorate the founding of the Organization of African Union in 1963. It was actually on the 25th of May, and the union later became the African Union. We are so pleased that there were 32 independent nations at the time that converged in Addis Ababa to foster cooperation and accelerate decolonization. We are gathered in this fashion to honor Africa's liberation from colonialization. You may wonder why we are celebrating that. Because Africa is still enduring anti-colonization struggles. It's quite significant. 1963, there were only 32 member states. In 2026, there are 55 member states. We still have our struggles as a continent, but we have made some positive strides. We are here to celebrate African diversity. We are a continent that is very rich in diversity. Africa Day in particular at Stellenbosch is hosted every year. And this is the 8th year that we are hosting the Africa Day lecture at Stellenbosch University. It is hosted in collaboration with the Center for the Study of Afterlife, of Violence and Reparative Quest, AVREC, and the Center for the Advancement of Social Impact and Transformation, CASIT. The lecture is held every year, every May since 2018, and it is a lecture that brings together distinguished scholars, scientists, writers, artists, public intellectuals, and practitioners from across the globe. The aim is to have conversations that expand the understanding of the role of a university in the changing and troubled times. Through the series, speakers open dialogue on topics that contribute to knowledge production within the academy, while those conversations shape public debate and we engage with society more broadly. This year's keynote address will be delivered by an acclaimed writer who is a historian and an assistant professor of African history at Brandeis University, Massachusetts in the US. Allow me to acknowledge the guests that are present. I will acknowledge the rector of the university and the members of the rectorate management team who are in our midst. Allow me to acknowledge Dr. Panache Chikumadzi, who is the guest speaker for the evening. Allow me also to acknowledge Prof. Phumla Gobodo-Madikizela, who is the Saatchi Chair in Violent Histories and Transgenerational Trauma and Director of the Center for the Study of Afterlife of Violence and Reparative Quest. It's quite significant that I acknowledge her presence because she has been a forerunner in planning and organizing these lectures. Not only that, but she will also be facilitating the dialogue this evening. Allow me to acknowledge each one of you in the room. Thank you for coming. and allow me to acknowledge all our guests who are joining us online. We traditionally host the Africa Day at Stellenbosch at the museum. I don't know the rationale, Prof. Phumla, but I suppose it's to foster sensory engagement. This evening, the museum is showcasing a new exhibition called New Pathways, Imzila Emitsha Nive Paiye. There is a stone in front of us. It is part of the art. Just look around, you can see the latest art acquisitions of the museum. What is significant about this artwork is that it is an exhibition that features renowned and emerging artists, and this marks the inaugural joint exhibition of these works. They have never been exhibited jointly anywhere. What is significant about this new work is that it covers the period from 2014 up to recent years, and this period somehow coincides with the appointment of Bongani Mgijima as the first ever Black African director of SU Museum. Lastly but not least, allow me to welcome the rector of the university who is going to do an opening address. He is Professor Deresh Ramjukenath, a chemical engineer, scholar of note in the field of chemical thermodynamics and separation technology. Not only that, he boasts of extensive governance experience. Join me in welcoming Prof. Deresh to the stage.
Thank you very much, Program Director, Dr. Zethu Mkhize. Our distinguished speaker this evening, Dr. Panache Chikumadzi, facilitator and patron of the Africa Day lecture, Professor Phumla Gobodo-Madikizela. And Professor Gobodo-Madikizela, congratulations once again on that national order that you received last week. Members of the Rectorate, our Pro-Vice Chancellors, our Deans, our heads of schools, divisions, and other university structures, members of our Student Representative Council, the Stellenbosch community and our business leaders, members of the Stellenbosch community at large, guests that are joining us via live stream from our campuses and from around the world, members of the media, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is a pleasure to welcome you this evening to Stellenbosch University and, as has been mentioned, to the 8th annual Africa Day lecture. Now, Africa Day invites us not only to reflect on where we have come from as a continent, but to take responsibility for where we are going to as a continent. We meet at a time when the stakes are high. The stakes are really high for Africa at this point in time. Across the continent, the questions before us are not abstract. The questions are about opportunity, the questions are about justice, about dignity, and the ability of institutions like universities to make a meaningful difference in the lives of Africans. Ultimately, universities will not be judged by what we say about ourselves. We will be judged by what we contribute. We will be judged by whether we are trusted to help solve real problems. We will be judged by whether we translate knowledge into impact. And we will be judged by whether we remain relevant in the societies that we serve. This is why platforms like the Africa Day lecture matter. Since its inception, this lecture series has created space for conversations that are both intellectually rigorous and publicly meaningful. It reminds us that scholarship does not exist in isolation. It must engage, it must challenge, and it must ultimately serve society. At Stellenbosch University, we speak about being a research-intensive university, rooted in Africa with global reach. Now, some of you may have seen that over the last week, I have been visiting a few countries in Africa, and the message has been very consistent about the role that Stellenbosch University wants to play in the advancement of the African continent. In fact, through two, you're going to call it visits and tours that I've done across the African continent in the last 12 months, there's been a tagline that's come out that speaks to what we want to be as a university. In Africa, with Africa, for Africa. But that positioning only matters if it is lived. It means building partnerships across the continent, not as an act of outreach, but as an act of collaboration. It means recognizing that Africa is not a problem to be solved, but a place of knowledge, innovation, and leadership. And it means confronting a reality we often return to, that the greatest challenge facing our continent is not a lack of potential, but the gap between potential and implementation. Bridging that gap is where universities on the continent must play their role. This is what makes this evening's lecture so timely. Dr. Panache Chikumadze's work challenges us to think deeply about history, justice, and the structures that continue to shape our present. Her lecture, Zinziani Lemvubu, The Hippo's Calf, engages with the questions of reparations, sovereignty, and the meaning of justice across generations. These are not easy conversations. They require intellectual honesty and moral clarity, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But if universities are serious about their role in society, these are exactly the conversations we must be willing to host and to engage in. Now, we are equally privileged to have Professor Phumla Gobodo-Madikizela with us this evening. Her work has shown us that confronting the past is not only about memory, it is about what we do with that memory. And the dialogue that follows this lecture is therefore not an add-on. It is central to the purpose of this evening, to engage, to reflect, and to listen. As we gather here tonight, we do so as part of a broader community, one that extends beyond this room and across the continent. Africa Day reminds us that the future of this continent will not be determined elsewhere. It will be shaped here on the African continent by the choices we make, by the ideas we pursue, and by the institutions that we build. And if we are to meet that responsibility, then universities must not only generate knowledge, they must ensure that it really matters. It is therefore my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Sophia Olivia Sanan, a lecturer and research fellow at AVREC, to officially welcome and introduce our guest speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. What a wonderful turnout. It's so lovely to see you. Good evening, Prof. Deresh. Good evening, Prof. Pumla. Good evening, Dr. Panashe. My name is Sophia Olivia Sana, and I work at AVREC, and we've had the pleasure of being involved in the Africa Day seminar lecture series for the last 8 years. And this evening, it's my distinct honor to welcome our guest and introduce a little bit about her. Dr. Panashe is a historian and rapporteur of the AU's Committee of Experts on Reparations on Slavery, Colonialism, and Apartheid. She earned her doctoral degree from the Harvard Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, and she's recently drafted the framework for the landmark resolution just passed by the UN a few months ago, declaring racialized chattel enslavement as the greatest crime against humanity. As mentioned by Dr. Mkhize, she's also an assistant professor of African history at Brandeis University. She's the founding editor of Vanguard magazine, a platform for Black women coming of age in post-apartheid South Africa. And she's the author of multiple award-winning publications, some of which you can familiarize yourself a little bit over there in the library that's been set up. Panashe has written These Bones Will Rise Again, which was shortlisted for the Alan Paton Prize. She's written Sweet Medicine, which won the K. Selodeka Literary Award, and an essay, What You Don't See When You Look at Me, which was awarded the 2019 Gordon Parks Foundation Prize. Her first play, Song Unburied, will debut at the Edinburgh International Festival this August, 2026. She's a former columnist for New York Times, contributing editor of the Johannesburg Review of Books. Her opinion pieces have been featured in The Guardian, The Washington Post, Boston Review, LA Review of Books, Die Zeit, Chimurenga, and Africa as a Country. Panashe, we're very, very honored to have you, and we really look forward to hearing you. Thank you so much for being here this evening.
Mangwana o tshwara tepa ka bogaleng. The mother of the child holds the knife by its edge. And so it was that it was the women, the mothers of the Khuring Khai Koina Khoi, who first held the knife by its edge when they sounded the war cry on the historic moment or the historic morning of the 1st of March, 1510. This was the morning of the first major battle in the centuries-long struggle for indigenous sovereignty on the subcontinent. This morning in 1510 was 22 years after Bartholomew Dias became the first European to round the sovereign Khoi territory called Khoi Khaib and opened the world's highway to India. It was on a beach underneath the mountain they called Hurikhoicha, or Hurikwacho, which the Portuguese knew as Cabo de Boa Esperanza, which the Dutch renamed Tafelberg, which the English renamed Table Mountain. The men responded to the war cry. By the day's end, 64 Portuguese lay dead on the beach, including the Viceroy of Portuguese India, Francisco de Almeida, commander of what was then the Earth's most powerful military imperial force. Fresh from his decisive 1509 victory at the Battle of Diu, where the Portuguese had defeated the combined navies of Gujarat's Sultanate, Egypt's Mamluk Sultanate, and the Calicut Zamorin to establish Portuguese supremacy over the Indian Ocean spice trade. And yet, because of these mothers' cry, the Portuguese were defeated and deterred for the next century. The Portuguese never again settled at the Cape. They routed their India trade through Mozambique instead. For the next century and a half, Chai Chaib was approached only by passing Dutch and English ships seeking water and provisions. Chai Chaib would remain sovereign Khoi territory for the next 120 or 142 years, rather, until the Dutch East India Company finally established permanent European settlement at the Cape in 1652 and created Cape Slave Society. That morning, the Portuguese had ostensibly come to barter cattle. This they had done since Diash's rounding of the Cape in 1488. The Haringai Khoi and the Portuguese had traded there. The Cape served as the Portuguese refreshment station on the long route to India. But these Portuguese were not to be trusted. The mothers knew that. This time, instead of bartering, they'd seized Khoi children. They violated the poor. For 69 years now, since the Portuguese sailor Antão Gonçalves had first captured a group of Africans off the Mediterranean coast in 1441, the Portuguese commenced the trafficking in enslaved Africans. And the papal bulls of the preceding decades, Dam Diversus in 1452, Romanus Pontifex in 1455, Atenus Regius in 1481, Inter Cetera in 1493, had authorized the seizure of African lands and the enslavement of African peoples, reducing us to perpetual slavery. And of course, it had authorized the European conquest of conquest of non-European lands through the so-called doctrine of discovery. Importantly, the Portuguese had established a slave trafficking outpost at Arguin off the coast of Mauritania by 1448 rather. And they'd built their first African slave fortress at Elmina on the Gold Coast of what is now Ghana in 1482. The Haringai Khoi woman had not sounded the war cry that morning just against Portuguese raiding. Many other African women would resist enslavement of their children at every site of the transatlantic and Indian trafficking in Africans. They ensured that their children would not risk being numbered amongst the tens of millions of Africans who would be trafficked across the Atlantic in the centuries that followed. And the Cape itself, like Elmina before it, might as well have become a Portuguese slave fortress. What the Khoi woman sounded the war cry against that morning was not a single Portuguese raiding party. It was, as we will see, a war cry against a new world order that racialized trafficking or racialized chattel enslavement had created. What the AU framework for reparations for racialized chattel enslavement, colonialism, and apartheid calls a world-breaking crime. It names this the definitive break in world history, that which inaugurated the transition from localized feudal regimes to the medieval world, or rather from the medieval world to the modern world racial capitalist system. They had sounded the war cry at its very inception. What the Haringai Khoi women did on that beach was express their sovereignty, our sovereignty. They defended the sovereignty of Chai Chaib against or in the name of their children. They embodied an indigenous political principle. This one in particular, the one that gives us the name or the title of this lecture. Akuko zinyane lemvubu ladliwa zingwenya kwaceba iziziba. It never happens that the hippo's calf is eaten by the crocodile and the pool remains still. There must be blood, there must be consequences. This is not an African proverb. To call it one is to reduce the rigor and depth of African political philosophy to folklore, to cast our philosophical and legal traditions as quaint sayings about animals and long ago peoples with little bearing on the present. It is neither. It is a juridical and philosophical maxim with the full weight of Pan-African legal tradition behind it. This is why, for example, the AU Framework for Reparations is called A Crime Does Not Rot, 1441 to present. Those of you who know African languages hear what is being translated in that title. As we'll speak of later, Icala aliwoli, Icala aliwoli, Mosha aiwori, Mulato aiwoli. That is part of our African jurisprudence, the radical Ubuntu that we seek to reclaim tonight. 3 propositions are folded into that maxim. First, the violation is named. The crime is plainly described, not euphemism, not encounter, not engagement, not transition, nor complex history. The crocodile took the calf. Second, the pool, the waters, will respond, not as moral aspiration, as structural fact. The cosmos of Ubuntu does not permit violation without consequence, because Ubuntu's universe is a universe of relation, and a violation, by definition, ruptures the relation. The pool churns, the bulls charge, there is blood. The water in which the crocodile has hunted becomes the medium of its own undoing. Third, and this is the deepest of the 3, which we'll speak to in more detail, but which is really spoken to in Icala aliwoli, A Crime Does Not Rot. There is no statute of limitations. The pool does not say, the calf is dead, let us declare the matter historical. The pool does not say, let us appoint a commission of inquiry, and once it has been reported, the matter is closed. The pool moves. The pool does not remain still because the violation is alive, alive in the absence of the calf, alive in the grief of the mother, alive in the broken structure of the pool. The calf is present, and it's absence that constitutes the pool's response. Mangwana o tshwara tipa ka bogaleng. The mother who holds the knife by its edge, with which I opened, and the hippo's mother, the Khoringhai Khoina woman who applied this on the beach in 1510. They sit inside a family of African dicta, the operative grammar of an indigenous African political philosophy that mandates the right to self-defense, the right to impose costs on those who cause harm to members of our community to ensure deterrence, the right to defend the pool against the crocodile. In other words, the cost imposition is the guarantee of non-repetition. This is the dictum I want to place at the center of our Africa Day lecture tonight, not, as we will talk about, the post-1994 individualized and interpersonalized Ubuntu of forgiveness without reparation. The Ubuntu based in Matthew, or the book of Matthew. This is the Ubuntu of the warring Khoringhai Khoina mothers defending our sovereignty in the name of their children. We sit here at Stellenbosch on Africa Day, the day in 1963 when the founders of the Organization of African Unity gathered in Addis Ababa under Kwame Nkrumah's exhortation that Africa must unite to declare the political sovereignty of the continent. 63 years later, the African Union, the successor of the OAU, has, on the 25th of March of 2026, secured the United Nations General Assembly resolution declaring the trafficking in enslaved Africans and racialized chattel enslavement the gravest crime against humanity. Ukubulela is central to the practice of Ubuntu, and so Siyabulela, Professor Phumla Gobodo Madikizela, for all your years of work, but of course in particular as the founding director of the Center for the Study of the Afterlife of Violence and Reparative Quest, which has hosted and conceptualized this lecture to connect and contextualize this university to the continent. And that's quite significant because part of what the central project of apartheid and settler colonialism in this country was to do was to remove this part of the continent or this subcontinent from the rest of the continent, which is why we still talk about going into Africa. Africans are people out there, not people here. So it's incredibly important. Thank you for your foresight and vision in instituting this lecture. Siyabulela, Stellenbosch University. Thank you, Professor Diresh Ramjagannath, Rector and Vice Chancellor, for hosting the lecture. Thank you to the AVRIC team, Dr. Sophia Olivia Asanan, to Janice and Lorinda, Crystal Peterson and her Media and Communications team, Conita Henry, JC Landman, Anal Lewis. They've been so wonderful. Thank you for hosting me truly in the spirit of Ubuntu. We very, very much appreciate. Anyone who I have not mentioned, please, I do thank you for how you've hosted me. And again, as we speak about many of these things, we often think about them as abstractions, but the practice of Ubuntu on a day-to-day basis is something that I very much felt when I've been here, so thank you. Of course, Siyabulela to the friends and comrades, in particular, my friend from all the way back in grade 2 in Bulugwane. So we speak about Bulugwane for the world. We were people who really caused a lot of ruckus in school. So thank you to my dear friend and sister, Bubbly. Thank you for being my bestie forever and for coming to support me here. Very much appreciate that. And of course, to the students, family, and friends, those of you who've come in today online as well, you help us to constitute what 19th century Nguni-speaking intellectuals called Ibandla Lenkanyiso, a council of enlightenment. So thank you very much for coming today. I'm looking forward to the conversation that we'll be having. And so, of course, for us in the post-apartheid era, what I've just spoken about, the idea of Ubuntu as an ethics of war and conquest must be quite jarring. Ubuntu in the post-apartheid era in particular was deployed in precisely the opposite register. The post-amble of the interim constitution of 1993 proclaimed, and I quote, "There is a need for Ubuntu in order to advance reconciliation and reconstruction. Amnesty shall be granted." Ubuntu therefore became the rationale for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's emphasis on amnesty and forgiveness. And yet, through my own archival work, recovering over 500 texts in African languages by Black writers in 19th century Black newspapers, the very basis of my forthcoming book, The World is Dead, Ilizwe Lifile, if you hear that translation, Ubuntu as an Ethics of War and Conquest under the 1779 to 1878 9 Wars of Dispossession, I demonstrate that Ubuntu formed the basis for indigenous conceptions of honorable conquest and the conduct of war, and in particular, of indigenous sovereignty. And importantly, I want to name the tradition of reclaiming Ubuntu, a radical Ubuntu that I am building on. Black feminist scholarship in this country and across the continent has long theorized Ubuntu as an ethics of care, of solidarity, and of repair. The Ghanaian theologian Mercy Amba Aduyoye draws on Ubuntu to articulate African ethics of solidarity and caregiving. Our very own Professor Pumla Gobodo Madigizela, who hosts us tonight, has spent a scholarly life reframing Ubuntu beyond the TRC and its framework of reconciliation into an important and rigorous ethics of care and repair. Professor Madiboina Masenya names Busadi ethics, an African womanist ethics of fierce, protective care. And the feminist philosopher, Bibi Bakari Yusuf, in her 2025 Tour de Force, Thinking with Bones and Brains, has linked my own work on Ubuntu as an ethics of war to this Black feminist tradition, naming what indigenous African philosophy has always held, that the ethics of care and ethics of war are not two separate ethics, but one. Self-defense is an enactment of care. The opposite of self-defense is not peace. The opposite is self-abandonment. This is the indigenous African feminist or ethics of war that long precedes the just war tradition from Victoria to Walser, who never registered this. And let me be precise about what motherhood in this tradition means in particular. In our traditions, motherhood is not essentialized as biological. It is the ethical duty of every adult, male or female, in community with children to be responsible for their well-being and their care. The Khoring Khaikoina women who sounded the war cry in the morning on the 1st of March 1510 were not all biological mothers of the children that the Portuguese seized. However, because they were mothers, because they were adults in the community with those children, they understood, as our traditions understand, that the protection of children is the ethical obligation of every adult in the community. This is what Mangwana Tshwara Tipakabo Kgaleng names, not biological maternal sentiment, communal ethical duty. Consider the example that should be more familiar to most of us. In Setswana, we say, "Sebatana ha se bokwe ka diatla." The attacks of the wild beast cannot be averted with bare hands alone. For those of you who actually read Long Walk to Freedom and not just skimmed through, you'll remember that Nelson Mandela invoked this in June 1961 meeting of the South African Communist Party in justifying his moral position on armed struggle. And I name this to say that very often we have a tradition of thinking about Black South Africa, thinking about our political actors without actually engaging their political thought. And it's important that we do that work of engaging rigorously, and this pertains in particular, very often we love to universalize the thought in terms of Marxist or Leninist thought without taking very seriously on its own terms what kind of political philosophy they were drawing on themselves. So here, it's quite important that Mandela explicitly invokes this principle in explicit response to the Christian pacifist principles of Inkosi Albert Luthuli, then president of the ANC, who had just been awarded the 1960 Nobel Peace Prize for nonviolence. Mandela's invocation made plain what indigenous African political philosophy has always held. The question of violence or nonviolence is not one of tactics, but of principle. The principle is sovereignty. The right to self-defense is rooted in the right to sovereignty, and the right to sovereignty is at the core of indigenous African political philosophy. And so, of course, in that moment, Sharpeville had just happened, and so it was required that the pool would respond. And so importantly, when we think in this moment, what does this have to do with the question of reparations at the continental level, at the global African level, is to think beyond the riverbank, beyond the rivers of this country, to remind ourselves that across here lies the Atlantic, and on the other side of this cape, the Indian Ocean. The Cape sits at the confluence of these waters, the southernmost tip or meeting point of two oceans across which our people were trafficked, across which African bodies were carried as cargo for 400 years to build the modern world racial capitalist system. And before returning to what exactly a radical African jurisprudence will mean, let us think to what exactly the nature of the crime is. The pools are important to think through because just as a fish cannot tell it is in water, it is difficult to know what you're swimming inside. For 6 centuries, those waters have surrounded us all, not as an event, but as the environment, the structure and the condition that make all life as we now know it possible. No one has escaped. And yet here, the pool or the crocodile remains in the pool is the ocean is the world that the definitive break in world history that the framework names, has made. When those women sounded the war cry against the Portuguese, attempting to seize their children in 1510, they sit alongside a longer architecture. As we mentioned, in 1441, the Portuguese Marina Antão Gonçalves had first seized 11 Africans who became the first cargo in the trafficking in enslaved Africans. 3 years later in Lagos, Portugal, on the 8th of August, 1444, Portuguese customs official De Freitas led the sale of 235 Africans in the first state-sponsored auction of enslaved Africans. And at that moment, the Portuguese chronicler Gomes Ences de Zurara wrote and captured the inaugural site of litigation. He says, "The mothers clasped their children with their arms and threw themselves flat on the ground with them, receiving blows with little pity for their own flesh, if only they might not be torn away from them," close quote. What he's saying here is that the mothers would rather have suffered death than be parted from their own children. And this is incredibly important for our historical memory. We did not need the 1815 Treaty of Vienna to tell us this was a crime. We have always known and understood it was a crime. This is the inaugural moment of litigation. This is from the very inception of the crime. We recognized this and identified this as a world-breaking crime, and we resisted it as such. Our enslavement, or rather our emancipation in the 19th century, was not the gift of British abolitionism. It was rather the work and the struggle of 6 centuries of African struggle, and we'll talk to that more. And so this is really important. 1441, this inaugural moment of racialized chattel enslavement. This is why the AU framework is called A Crime Does Not Rot, 1441 to present. It names the beginnings of this world-breaking crime. And this framework provides what we call the structural rationale for the UN Assembly and the resolution which Ghana introduced on the 25th of March, 2026. And what I want to name here for our audience and go through quite importantly is what exactly is the structural rationale, because we've seen in the media most of the responses really just landed on the spectacularity of the naming of the gravest crime against humanity, but not really dealt with and really unpacked what the 42 preambular paragraphs say. In particular, the 42 preambular paragraphs, which many of you might know, is exceptionally long for a UN resolution. This is because the UN resolution that Ghana put forth is not just a statement that Africans or something bad had happened to Africans. It is an intellectual and historiographical intervention into a series of debates about what exactly is the origins of the world as we know it. For those of us who are economists or people who work within economic history, we know that people like, or rather the father of modern Western capitalism, Adam Smith, declared that the rounding of the Cape of Good Hope and the so-called discovery of the New World is the beginnings of modern capitalism, and in particular, he calls it the 2 greatest events in the history of mankind. Now that's important, but it's partial. Even Adam Smith, who himself railed against slavery and was an avid abolitionist, failed to mention the Africans in the hull of that ship. Similarly, Karl Marx, who himself was very much an avid abolitionist as well, he was part of those who supported the Northern cause in the American Civil War in 1865. He fails to mention when he says the beginnings of capitalism are the English enclosure, the British Industrial Revolution in the 17th century. He does not mention, despite living in Manchester, the very heart of British enslavement, the Africans who make racial capitalism or capitalism possible in the very first place. And so part of what the resolution does is to rename and recenter what makes possible this so-called voyages of discovery, the rise of capitalism across the world. For those of you who do international relations, for example, you'll know the beginning of the world modern system is supposedly the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. But here, when we go through the resolution, it does the painstaking work of rethinking through and restating what is the history of the world as we know it, what is the beginnings of that structure. And so here, the AU framework in particular says that this is the definitive break in world history. Again, those of you who've read the likes of Hannah Arendt, who write that it is 20th century totalitarianism, which is the break in the Occidental tradition, we go and we draw on Toni Morrison, declaring that slavery is what broke the world in half. We also draw on isiXhosa-speaking ancestors in the 19th century who always declared during and throughout the 9 wars of dispossession that ilizwe lifile, the world is dead. So our ancestors have always known and understood that these are world-breaking crimes long before the West finally understood this. And so why do we say this is world-breaking crimes? It means that this is not just something that affects people of African descent. This is not a black issue alone. It's not a diaspora issue, especially those of us in the continent who might think, yes, in solidarity, I am for and support my brothers and sisters in the diaspora. But we need to understand how this structurally transformed the world as we know it, both materially and metaphysically. As we'll come to see, racialized chattel enslavement is the womb of the world, metaphysically and materially. It is the break that redefined the world because it introduced new and racialized regimes of labor, property, territory, and sovereignty that had never been seen across the world, and that continue to shape the world as we know it, and we'll go and speak to this. And this transformation was planetary. It is the very roots of what we know and now understand as the so-called climate crisis. We'll see that the crime of racialized chattel enslavement is what inaugurates a particular kind of property logic that then allows for the transition from monocultures, transition from indigenous stewardship to the kind of exhaustive understanding around how we treat nature. If people are fair game for property, what more for how we treat nature itself? And so we come to understand that the plume of the factory is inseparable from the plantation. Climate debt is colonial debt. This transformation, the structural transformation, was planetary in the Americas. Indigenous people suffered a genocide which wrought 90% population collapse to clear the land which enslaved Africans picked and plowed. As W.E.B. Du Bois established, by 1860, 400 million enslaved people in the US were valued at $3.5 to $4 billion, more than all the country's railroads and factories combined. In Europe, plantation profits funded the Industrial Revolution, transforming the European peasant into the proletarian and laundering blood profits through the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the world's first global financial clearinghouse. And importantly, the Atlantic did not spare Eastern Europe's non-colonial powers either. The insatiable hunger to feed grain in the New World plantations created the second serfdom of the peasants and the Kozaki of Poland, Lithuania, and the Baltic. Even the Nordics were involved. Finnish tar-sealed British slave ships in Liverpool. The same European men who managed the companies that trafficked enslaved Africans and those that colonized Asia. Geronimo de Hayes was the mayor of Amsterdam, who sat on both the Dutch East India Company and Dutch West India Company boards. Sir William Mathers or Withers was the mayor of London, who sat on both the Royal African Company and the director of the British East India Company. And so it was that the very same Atlantic profits that funded the conquest of India financed the Opium Wars, forcing Chinese markets open at gunpoint and making China's peasants vulnerable to kidnap for indenture when abolition came. And this is incredibly important because, for example, South Africa helps us see what happens after abolition, how slavery continues to structure the way that the world advances. South Africa sees that legacy. I was just saying to our rector that I grew up in Durban, Durban being the home of one of the largest diaspora of people of African, or rather Indian descent, and that is a direct legacy of the history of enslavement. The indentured laborers who were taken to replace so-called the Africans who could no longer legally be enslaved through a new form of paid enslavement, indenture. And so we see that nobody was left untouched by the logic of racialized chattel enslavement. And so it is not just a Black issue, an African issue, it is a global issue, a continuing structure, a crime that the world built. And in Africa itself, most importantly, the loss of millions of our mothers and fathers and daughters and sons across 4 centuries remains our greatest ancestral wound. The militarized slave forts scarring our coastlines stand as testimony to the permanent structure of war that racialized chattel enslavement imposed on African societies. And this is incredibly important to understand that fundamentally, slavery and racialized chattel enslavement is a condition of war. In 1526, Alfonso I, King of Congo, wrote in one of 24 letters decrying the kidnapping of his people to the King of Portugal, saying, "Every day our nobles, our people, our relatives are taking, and we cannot reckon how great the damage is," close quote. Whether king or commoner, on the continent or in the diaspora, the structure of racialized chattel enslavement was indifferent. It racialized all Black peoples as enslavable property, and Africa as the permanent site of capital extraction. And the transformation was not only material, it was also metaphysical. In 1631, from Amsterdam, in which the Dutch West India Company was at the height of its Atlantic operations, René Descartes, the father of modern Western philosophy, wrote to Balzac, the sovereign of French Letter of Republics, "It gives me just as much pleasure to watch the ships arriving, laden with the produce of the Indies." In what other country could you find such complete freedom? 6 years later, in 1637, Just as the Dutch West India Company had conquered Elmina Castle on the West African coast and accelerated the trafficking in enslaved African bodies, René Descartes published the central dictum of Western philosophy, or modern Western philosophy. I think, therefore I am. The founding proposition of modern Western philosophy was birthed in the same city and year in which Amsterdam had accelerated the trafficking in Africans. The European mind became free, the African body became owned. Bodilessness was the precondition for reason. To think was to transcend the body, to be owned was to be reduced to the body. The Cartesian mind-body dualism, which is at the heart of the founding of modern Western philosophy, is very much part and parcel and shaped by the trafficking in enslaved Africans. And I want us to remember that, because I'll come back to why I am because we are is a mistranslation of Ubuntu, but hold that for now. Because I is a very particular subject within the West. I is enabled by our reduction to our bodies. The freedom that Descartes speaks about is bought through our unfreedom. And so we see that the body of the enslaved African was structurally linked to the indigenous American, the Polish peasant, the Finnish tar maker, and the Chinese indentured worker in one global circuit. Every single region of the planet was pulled into the orbit of the Atlantic system. There was no outside. And what is incredibly important for us to recognize is how systematic the reduction of Africans to property was across more than 5 imperial jurisdictions, the Portuguese Peça de Indias of 1513, which reduced the African person to a fractional unit of commercial measurement, wherein the adult male body was the standard peça against which an adult woman was calculated as 2/3 of a peça, a child as 1/2, and an infant as 1/3. We go to the French Code Noir of 1685, which defined the enslaved person as movable furniture. But what is most devastating about international law, which slavery or chattel slavery produced, is that it reduced the African person to property in perpetuity. Now, this is incredibly important because many people will speak about, well, what about the Arab slave trade? What about the other forms of enslavement? This is the key distinction. Previous forms of enslavement, from the helots of Sparta to the Zanj of the Abbasid Caliphate, reduced captive peoples to unpaid laborers through war, debt, or trade. What was structurally unprecedented was that racialized chattel slavery replaced the external frontiers of war and debt with black women's wombs into the site of war. In particular, as black feminist scholars such as Jennifer L. Morgan have shown, it was through the legal principle partus sequitur ventrum, status follows the womb, first codified in Virginia in 1662, that black women's reproduction became, in the words of Bibi Bakari Yusuf, not the reproduction of mothering, but the reproduction of capital. Through this law, blackness was juridically constituted as a matrilineal heritage of slaveness, reproduced exclusively through the enslaved black mother's womb, regardless of paternity. An enslaved black man could not father enslaved children with a white woman. Only black women could confer the status of enslaved. And so the slaveholding American president, Thomas Jefferson, who fathered at least 6 enslaved children with the enslaved black woman, Sally Hemings, explicitly exploited and named the centrality of black women to the formations of racial capitalism, saying, "I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man of the farm. What she produces is an addition to capital." And so by writing war into the womb, it ensured that the structural transition from the slave as captive laborer, a temporary condition of war, debt, or trade, into the slave as capital, a hereditary financial instrument, a transgenerational condition of being that appreciates, that reproduces, and collateralizes the whole global financial order from what we call so-called natural increase. This is why, for example, the 132 enslaved cargo thrown overboard with the Zong slave ship to secure Lloyd's Banks of London in 1781, and the payout of more than £30 per head, approximately £6,700 today, for the lost assets. And so this is part of the dark genius of racial capitalism. Black women's wombs became the womb of modern racial capitalism. Importantly, Black women's wombs became the central structural mechanism for reproducing Black non-sovereignty across generations and geographies. As I've shown elsewhere, racialized chattel enslavement structured anti-Blackness not as a discriminatory logic, but as a reproductive logic that mutated from the New World plantation to the apartheid Bantustan. By refusing Black men the family wages it paid white men, Southern Africa's violent migrant labor system extracted Black women's unpaid reproductive labor in the so-called native reserves to subsidize mining and farming capital's spectacular profits. In this way, both settler colonial capital's profits and white men's family wages were the dividend paid out of our Black mothers' and grandmothers' unpaid reproductive labor and the systematic destruction of our Black families. Confined to the Bantustan, Black women became the world's womb, the sites of war, of enclosure, and of capture, condemned to reproducing captive kin. Acting as a jealous and possessive God, granting life and death, the migrant labor system only gifted us, our grandfathers and fathers, to us for annual conception leave until it finally spat out living corpses to die once and for all in our grandmothers' and mothers' arms. In this perpetual pieta, Black women are the Marys of a world that survives only by crucifying our kin and consuming our being. Now and then, Black women are the world's womb. As the first frontier annexed as capital, Black women became the wombs of modern racial capitalism. Wombs are lineage's first territory. If we do not have sovereignty over our own wombs, what other meaningful sovereignty can we have? And so from this, we come to understand that race is sovereignty. And through this foundational legal principle, partus sequitur ventrum, anti-Blackness is a reproductive logic of property and capital that structures the African person as the world's ultimate non-sovereign. And so let us name the kind of sovereignty that the Goring-Haikona woman expressed that morning. By 1652, Jan van Riebeeck, or when he had come and stepped ashore on the same Cape Coast, was about to enter into a different war. A war the slaver-slater structure would conduct against the indigenous woman as a pool itself. Krotoa, the niece of the Goring-Haikona leader, Achumau, brought in van Riebeeck's household at the age of 11, and was dead on Robben Island at 31. Sarah Baartman, or Sariki Baartman, was trafficked from the Cape to be exhibited across London and Paris as the so-called Hottentot Venus, dead in Paris at 26. Her remains held by France until 2002, thanks to the work of Diana Ferris. The thousands of unarmed Khoi and San women raped and murdered in the commandos of the VOC, formally licensed in 1673, 6 years before this town was founded. These are the women on whose dispossession slaver-settler society of this Cape was built. We sit here tonight in Stellenbosch, and I want to place this town carefully in the long durée of what we're gathered to think about. Stellenbosch's greatest crime is conventionally narrated as the intellectual heart of apartheid. Of course, apartheid's grand architect Verwoerd held the chairs in applied psychology and sociology at this very university before he entered government. The Broederbond was constituted nearby. The Dutch Reformed Church theologized dispossession into divine providence. All of this is true. But this familiar framing performs an act of erasure. By centering Stellenbosch's role in the 46 years of apartheid, 1944, or rather 1948, until 1994, it overemphasizes apartheid and de-emphasizes the long history of conquest beginning in 1652 and really going all the way back to 1441. In so doing, it erases and makes impossible the thinking of ending of settler colonial conquest and its foundational structures of land dispossession, genocide, enslavement, and indenture. Stellenbosch, as you know, was founded in 1679 by the Dutch East India Company Governor Simon van der Stel as part of the agrarian expansion into the interior. Of course, the indigenous Khoi and San peoples fiercely refused subjugation on their dispossessed land. Between 1652 and 1806, the Dutch trafficked at least 600,000 enslaved souls, or 63,000 enslaved souls, into the Cape and waged slave raids onto the Khoi, Khoi, and San through the commandos that the Dutch East India Company had formerly licensed. In the vineyards of Stellenbosch, the constitutive architecture of South African master slave society was engineered centuries before the National Party officially codified apartheid in 1948. And this slave society endured. The enslaved consistently outnumbered the settlers at the Cape from 1711 until emancipation in 1834. This meant that South Africa was not just a society with slaves, it was a slave society. And when emancipation came to the Cape in 1834, it was not, as we've said, the gift of 19th century British abolitionism or British liberalism. It was the hard-won struggle of the centuries-long 6th century Pan-African and Afro-diasporic jurisprudence of struggle and an abolitionist tradition. From the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804, to the Sam Sharp Rebellion in Jamaica, and here, the Goa Bokkenveld 1825 uprising led by Galant van der Kaap. These were the actual authors of emancipation of the Cape, at the Cape. And what the British paid in 1834 was not the price of moral conviction, it was the price of containment. Very often when we talk about the history of this country, we very rarely talk about the history of the reparations that were actually paid to the enslavers in this country. First and foremost, the British state or the British Empire paid £20 million in 1834 to slave owners across its empire, approximately 2.7 billion in today's terms, 40% of the British National Treasury at the time, and the largest single outlay in British history until the 2008 bank bailouts. Here in South Africa, the Cape Colony received 100 or 1.247 million pounds of that 20 million, nearly 4 billion rand in today's terms. And Stellenbosch in particular, Stellenbosch district, held 8,452 enslaved people at emancipation in 1834, second only to Cape Town. Its claimants received approximately 300,000 pounds of the Cape's 100 or 1,247 million. That money built the Cape of Good Hope Bank of 1837, whose 144 founding shareholders included 63 former slave owners. It seeded the Stellenbosch capital that would assemble itself by the 20th century as Sanlam, Naspers, and the Rupert dynasty. The 1834 settlement is the Stellenbosch Mafia's founding capital. It is in this room, it is around us, and the data was transcribed by historians at this very university, documented and unspoken. And yet, even with this £1 million reparations, Cape slaveholders did not accept, or rather resisted, abolition. The 1835 to 1846 Great Trek, as a Voortrekker leader Piet Retief proclaimed in his famous 1837 manifesto against the British emancipation, declared, "We complain of the severe losses with which we have been forced to sustain by the emancipation of our slaves." And it was not the project of white men alone. Retief's own niece, Anna Steenkamp, wrote in her track memoir, "It is not so much their freedom that drove us to such lengths as their being placed on an equal footing with Christians, contrary to the laws of God and the natural distinction of race and religion. So it was that it was intolerable for any decent Christian to bow down beneath such a yoke, wherefore we withdrew in order to preserve our doctrines in purity." Boer women who would be institutionalized as volksmoeders of the late 19th century and 20th century Afrikaner nationalism, as it were not the moderating influence on slaveholder ideology. There were two its theologians. White women's brooms produced purity. Black women's brooms produced poverty. And so we see, whereas in America, the slave-holding Southern Confederacy fought in the 1861 to 1865 American Civil War to preserve slavery, the supposedly empty Southern African interior allowed the slave-holding Boer voortrekkers to migrate inland to reestablish what Retief called proper relations between master and servant, close quote. And so we see, for those who remained at the Cape, the Master and Slave Society was simply transformed through the Masters and Servants Act, which would govern Southern African labor relations for 134 years until 1974. And even those who were exiled into the new territories, we saw the British follow them and anchor, or rather annex the Natal colony in 1843 and later the Transvaal on the pretext of protecting natives from Boer slavery. And yet the very irony of this is that long after the British officially abolished slavery at the Cape, the 1866 discovery of diamonds at Kimberley and the 1886 discovery of the world's largest gold stores on the Witwatersrand kicked off Southern Africa's minerals revolution. And here, slavery remained the ghost in the monstrous machine of Southern African industrial capital. British mining capital's solution to the native labor question was a system directly modeled on Brazilian slave mining, the carceral compound labor system. This was a direct rearticulation of the transatlantic plantation logic. The South African minerals revolution propagated the compound and the mining pass, once again fixing black men as cheap captive labor. Slavery did not haunt the mines from outside. It was the very architecture from which it was built. And so we see that apartheid did not invent the master and servants regimes or the mining compound. Verwoerd only inherited an architecture. He did not invent it. And so this is the deeper inheritance that we need to name. The wealth generated by slave labor in the Western Cape wine industries birthed an Afrikaner landed gentry that would become the political and financial masterminds of the 20th century National Party. The 1834 compensation did not only see the Cape of Good Hope Bank, at least 1.5 million of Cape compensation capital, including from absentee mortgage holders and Cape Town merchants, was channeled into the South African Bank of 1838, the Eastern Province Bank of 1838, and a constellation of insurance companies. This is the financial scaffolding of 20th century Stellenbosch capital. And so sitting here centuries later, I want to remind us and go back to thinking about what reconciliation truly would mean in the face of this stolen and dispossessed wealth that we continue to see structuring our society today. The global reparations agenda our continent is now leading is the recovery of that radical Ubuntu and recovery of these longer histories. This is why the AU's framework is titled and thinking through racialized chattel enslavement, colonialism, and apartheid, understanding this as a longue durée and not separate historical epochs. We cannot understand apartheid without understanding the longue durée of enslavement, not just in this country, but really within the broader world. And so as part of then moving away from that domestication of apartheid as a safer project with which to fight against, and rather the longer history of settler colonial conquest, it is again going back to rethinking and reclaiming, as we spoke about at the beginning, the radical Ubuntu. What I want to come back to, remember we spoke about René Descartes and the I as a very particular subject, a subject who is formed within the womb of the trafficking of enslaved peoples. We have, and it pains me to say as a good African child, the mistranslation of Ubuntu as I am because we are by the Kenyan theologian John Mbiti in his classic 1969 book, African Religions and Philosophies. And we then have to remember that amongst us, Southern, Eastern, and African speakers of South Africa's Isintu language speakers, Ubuntu is a philosophy of ethical, a philosophy of personhood embodied in the dictum, umuntu ngumuntu ngabanye bantu. Although it's not possible to fully translate the fullness of African metaphysical worlds into English without losing its meaning, it's most correctly translated into English as a person is a person through other people. So in other work, I have done the extensive work of really going through what are the dangerous consequences of transposing the I into this philosophy, in particular an I who's a very historically situated subject, the Cartesian subject who's an individualized, rational subject apart from the embodied African. In particular, for Mbiti at that moment, understandably, the intervention was to show that African philosophies and religions are coherent. They do have a philosophy, and so the best way to do that was to show an African analog to the founding dicta of modern Western philosophy, I think, therefore I am, and so he then comes up with, I am because we are. Well-meaning though it was, part of what it does is that it means that we have a conception of Ubuntu that is individualized, whereas Ubuntu is very much of a social and a dynamic conception of being a person, umuntu, a person, not a human, a person, a very particular subject, who's always becoming through their community of people, abantu. This is why we say in our languages, ningenze umuntu ebantweni, right? We have made me a person amongst people. You cannot be a person by yourself. It is something that you need the entire community of being in order to become. Importantly, you cannot only become a person through the people before you. You also need your ancestors in order to become a person. You also need the people who will come after you to become a full person. You are accountable to all those peoples across time and space. And so part of this, and I always speak about the fact that Ubuntu, even at the interpersonal level, is exceptionally difficult. When I was younger, and sometimes now, my mother would scold me and say, "Itamunu," be a person. The idea being that social personhood is something you're constantly becoming and can fail at any moment as part of a state of social death. And so it's no mistake, for example, when we talk of war, Isizwe, or rather Imfazwe, is the idea of a death of a nation, death of a people. It is a death towards people, and this is what is really important about understanding Ubuntu beyond the interpersonalized, individualized way in which we understood it through the TRC. And so part of this, what's really important, and we see in this post-TRC moment, we have the likes of Angie Groch, for example, who speak about this idea of the TRC as a moment in which individuals can forgive individuals for individual acts, for example. But this here, as I say, is not part of the understanding of Ubuntu as the need for reckoning for structural harms that have been created across generations. This is what the process of the TRC then subverts. Importantly, in particular, when the TRC speaks to the idea, or rather it is mandated to look at crimes from 1960 Sharpeville and going up until 1994, gross human rights violations by individuals, you are then only, one, speaking to the fact that, one, you are truncating these crimes from 1652, only from 1960 up until 1994, but also you're only looking at the most spectacular forms of violence, leaving undone the structural harm that was done by settler colonialism and apartheid. And so if this is done in the name of Ubuntu, this is already directly refuted when we say, "Icala aliboli," a crime does not rot, because these are intergenerational crimes which cannot be circumscribed by 1960 to 1994. And so importantly, what is quite important for us to understand, what has long been criticized by many people, including the likes of Alan Busak, is this Christianized Ubuntu from the Book of Mark, and Ubuntu dramatized through the TRC as a journey of self and individual subjectivity, of healing and forgiveness, interpersonal relations that come to be institutionalized. Again, I want to quote properly Ankie Groch, who writes, "The Ubuntu forgiveness says, I forgive you so that you can change, you can heal, that I can start on my interconnected path towards healing." This is why Beyers Naudé, a Dutch reform minister who was one of the few Afrikaners to publicly move against apartheid, says, "In some incredible way, God has shown or sown the seeds of gracious attitude of the spirit of Ubuntu in the hearts and minds of the whole African community." Together, Groch and Naudé come to embody the failures of even the most sincere and committed part of white South Africa to truly reckon with what the radical ethical demands of Ubuntu would require of them as a collective. a collective who continue to benefit from the unjust conquest of Black peoples and their land. And so we see that eye that has traveled from Rene Descartes in Amsterdam at the height of the Dutch slave trading age says, if liberalism holds that I, the autonomous rational subject, is the fundamental unit of society, the I of the individualized and interpersonalized Ubuntu rationalize both the aspirations of the architects of the post-apartheid liberal constitutional order and the actualities of the disastrous non-racial liberalism that has birthed a rate of inequality so spectacular that two individual white men, Nicky Oppenheimer and Johann Rupert, own as much wealth as the bottom half of the majority of the population. It's unsurprising then that many Black South Africans believe that there's been neither truth nor reconciliation and have become disillusioned with the neoliberalized, individualized, interpersonalized Ubuntu that suffuses the so-called or the whole constitutional order of the so-called Rainbow Nation. To be sure, while the TRC didn't have the mandate to address the historic conquest of the land, the TRC did recommend reparations to victims and families who testified. Tutu himself did call for a wealth tax on all white South Africans. But again, what is really important for us to understand that this did not happen as the result of only individual actions. It happens within a global political economy. It is the fall of the Berlin Wall, for example, the rise of neoliberalism at that moment, what Francis Fukuyama would call the end of history, a particular moment where we're forced into thinking away from radical redistribution to thinking about how this economy can be integrated within a neoliberal capitalist structure. This is the moment with which the TRC is entering into. This is the moment which the likes of Tutu are coming into. So this is not about individuals, it's understanding the structures and the global constraints with which people are entering into. And in fact, when we understand that geopolitical structure of sovereignty, it is remembering that the fact that Zimbabwe at the time was told, and Thabo Mbeki has written about this in particular, was told to hold off on its project of land redistribution after 1980, despite the fact that this was the centrality of our struggle. They were asked to hold off to ensure that there would be international support for the end of apartheid. And so what that moment is telling us is that there will be support for the end of apartheid, i.e. the support for the end of segregation, for example, the democratization of the settler state, but we will not have global support for indigenous sovereignty. That's the moment with which South Africa comes into being. That's the moment in which we have the TRC. That's the moment in which we have the recruitment of Ubuntu as an ethics of forgiveness for individuals, for individual harms. We leave the structural harm of indigenous non-sovereignty completely untouched. That's the moment that we're coming into. And of course, for us then is to understand that in this moment, we're in a slightly different, or a rather radically different geopolitical moment that we come into in this time. We see that this is the end of the so-called rules-based international order. We remember, for example, earlier this year at Davos, Mark Carney, who is the head of a middling sovereign power, Canada, speaks about the fact that this is a rupture, the end of a particular order. Of course, they had just ratified the taking of Maduro in his pajamas from that, and that really is the kind of Western undermining of sovereignty. But in that moment, he's speaking to and confessing that there has been a rules-based order in which there are rules for the weak, rules and non-rules for the strong. And when we look at that global political order, and particularly when we look at that UN resolution, it offers a geopolitical map of sovereignty. It is quite interesting to see that those 123 nations, largely of the global south, are those who are historically understood as non-sovereign. Those 52 who vote, and rather who abstain from the vote, tended to be and are largely drawn from those nations who are historically understood as sovereign. And of course, the 3 who then vote against America and its junior partner, Israel and Argentina. America is the world's super sovereign. So of course, in that moment, we're seeing a kind of mapping of sovereignty there. And that's really important for us to understand, because part of what we're seeing with this reparations struggle is a real understanding that this is not just a question of moral suasion, but rather a question of sovereignty, a geopolitical question of sovereignty. And where we see that in particular is to say, who has the sovereign right to determine what is or isn't a crime? As I've documented elsewhere, last week I had a lecture at SOA speaking about the history of Icala Aliboli, a crime does not rot. We saw that in response to the resolution, Britain and the EU responded to the Ghana resolution's invocation of Icala Aliboli, a crime does not rot, saying that this is merely regional jurisprudence outside of the reach of so-called international law. And this is quite important because Britain also in particular then says that this is outside of the rules of intertemporality. You cannot speak or rather retrospectively of the sins of the father, things have happened in the past. Now, again, what is quite important when we pay attention to history is that this is not a new tactic, in particular for Britain. In this country, there's a long history, particularly under the 9 Wars of Dispossession, of the undermining and the specific targeting of a crime does not rot. When we look at sovereigns such as Ngangelizwe of Abatembu, for example, he indicts this and speaks specifically of a crime does not rot in response to statutes of limitations that are being put forth by the Natal Code of 1891. There's that constant way in which, for example, we have the 1858 so-called K-word compendium on law, or K-word compendium of laws and customs. They specifically say that these K-words do not have any statute of limitations. They're very aware of this particular history and this juridical tradition, and they suppress it, in particularly after the end of the Wars of Dispossession. And in suppressing this particular tradition that we have, it's important that they've suppressed this after the 9 Wars of Dispossession to legally consolidate the end of Black sovereignty in Southern Africa. And then we see very soon after, in the decades that follow, we have the rise of what we now understand as international reparations jurisprudence with the 1928 Chaucer factory case, in which Germany sues for the return of its lost factory after World War I from Poland, and it is then mandated that reparations are the mandatory consequence of wrongdoing between sovereigns. So this is important. African reparations jurisprudence has been suppressed and criminalized under so-called customary law in the 19th century in Africa, only for the West to turn around to then create its own reparations jurisprudence to consolidate sovereignty after its own internal wars. And that's really important to us to understand what I call the Africa exception in global reparations. We see that across the 20th century, the West has demonstrated its capacity to pay reparations. It has done so, for example, with the Israeli state after 1952 with the Luxembourg Agreement. We've seen it with the case of the Japanese Americans interned after the World War. There is a capacity to pay reparations to non-Western states and peoples that it recognizes as sovereign. In the case of the Mau Mau, for example, William Hague says, yes, we will pay, however, we will continue to decline or to deny liability. In the case of the Mau Mau, Germany says, well, first of all, this is not genocide, or it is only genocide in today's terms. It was not a crime in our jurisprudence. But most importantly, it also says that this is development aid. So this naming of reparations, the paying of reparations, is something that we only do for sovereign states. Very recently, we saw France, just last week, declaring for the first time a French president utters the word reparations 10 times. But what is quite important in this moment is that, one, he doesn't state what reparations will be paid, how much will be paid, when will be paid, and he doesn't, most importantly, mention the 1825 Haitian indemnity that France extorted from Haiti for daring to declare itself sovereign in 1804. Now, what is quite important with Haiti and France, it is the exemplar of this Africa exception. Haiti, in 2003, through President Aristide, demands the restitution of this indemnity, which has now grown to more than $21 billion at that time. What is the Western response? This is almost a moot question that is posed by Haiti to the West. How can property demand its own value back? The response? is a coup, which is the ultimate denial of sovereignty. And so we're seeing that this kind of idea that reparations are unthinkable, to use the Haitian historian Michel Rolfe-Trouillier's idea of unthinkability of black sovereignty that the Haitian Revolution embodied, this is what is operating with the global reparations, Africa exception around reparations. The West has the money, it knows the maths, it has demonstrated its capacity to pay reparations to former enslavers, to non-Western nations it recognizes as sovereign, but it will not pay reparations to Africans, a people of African descent, because it does not want to and will not go past flag independence and recognize its former African property as sovereign. And so this is the key for us to understand, that just now we see France demanding or talking about reparations just after it has been kicked out of the Sahel and its economy is suffering crisis. It has just put forth staged its France-Africa Summit, or rather it called it the Africa-France Summit, to try and reel back its influence on the continent because it is dependent on its African assets. And so France speaking to reparations, again using the language and the vocabulary of justice without actually paying the cost of justice, is very much a shrewd geopolitical move. It's done just before Ghana puts forth, or rather hosts, its conference on reparations next month. It does so just before the AU puts forth its common position on reparations. It's a preemptive strike to define the terms of engagement. We need to understand it for what it is. And so in this moment for us is to then see that clearly reparations must go beyond the question of moral suasion. It must be, in terms of thinking, about the question of cost imposition. Cost imposition is important because every single struggle of importance for us as Black peoples has always only ever been won when the cost of continuing has been higher than the cost of not paying Black peoples. This is what happened with the Haitian Revolution. This is what happened with apartheid. It was not because our apartheid oppressors at the time suddenly gained a moral consciousness. The country had become ungovernable. It was no longer sustainable to continue the system. And so the same kind of thinking must also govern how we think about reparations now. It is the question of what is the sovereign cost imposition that we're going to put forth to ensure that reparations is going to be paid and made serious as part of a geopolitical agenda. As I've said, the shifting geopolitical structure, the tectonic shifts that we're seeing in the global order are an opportunity for us. Practically, for example, we see how Africa has 30% of the world's known critical mineral resources that are required for the so-called just transition. Africa itself can also decide that, look, unless you pay a particular amount or unless you agree to particular terms, you will not have access to these resources. But part of what this requires, what sovereignty requires, the collective personhood, it requires us to come together as African peoples and to come together as African peoples both on the continent and in the diaspora. This is what is important for us to understand. And as I've said here, and as for us to understand that if slavery and racialized chattel enslavement was a world-breaking crime, it is for us to understand that it will require a world-making reparations project. We spoke earlier of Ilizwe Lifile, the world is dead, and here we're saying this world order is dying. And so reparations cannot just be about a check or inclusion into a dying world order. It requires us to think and reimagine fundamentally what this world can be, what kind of person it could be, how do we relate to each other. This is the kind of radical imagination that Ubuntu allows us to bring forth into a new world. As we spoke earlier, we've said, Icala aliboli. Thank you to Professor Nomtam Sankratisani, who has reminded me that it's not just that Icala aliboli, it is that Icala aliboli liyaqandusela. It germinates, it gestates. It creates new crimes. The crimes compound until they are paid. And it is for us as Africans, we've seen the historical record. We cannot wait for the moral consciousness of our former oppressors and colonizers to suddenly recognize us as human. Who needs humanity anyway? We are persons anyway, a far more richer conception of being in the world. And so this is part of the opportunity. It is for us to rethink fundamentally the world is dead, but that is also the opening, the opportunity for us to rethink and reimagine a world-making project. And so this is the opening that we have tonight, that radical opening for us to rethink what kind of world is possible when everything is up for grabs. This is what world making means, to rethink fundamentally in the same way that our predecessors, Kwame Nkrumah with the OAU, fundamentally rethought what does the world look like when it's remade in Africa's image. And so this is the invitation. Ijala aliwoli, ilizwe lifile. The world is dead, but a new world is waiting for us to restore. Thank you.
Thank you. As you can see, there's a lot of excitement about your message this evening. Thank you so much. You brought so much of yourself, intellectually, your presence. We are so privileged to have you. Thank you very, very much. It's going to be quite difficult for me not to simply abuse my position. There's always the temptation to do so. I want to make sure that we get the audience, I can see everyone. But I'm going to try not to abuse my position. You know, you end in a way that, for me, is so important by speaking about an opening for us to rethink a new world order. I really like that because, you know, obviously you are, what the subject you're dealing with is a grave one. And so that all of the depth of these atrocities and the histories of these atrocities, you lay them out in a way that really I've never heard it just laid out in such a profoundly historical and with so much clarity. We really, I think everyone will agree that you've brought this to our attention in such a powerful way that you can see the genealogy of Black suffering, right? All beginning with the cry of those women. I really loved it. And in a way, I want to go back to that cry. And for you to help us think about how might we use that cry, because women are very central in the conversation that you are inviting us to have. Women are very central, both as the ones who bear the pain, but at the same time, that image of women protecting. You know, is there anything that we can draw from that? Even thinking, holding tight to the notion of Ubuntu. Is there something from that story, from almost that origin story, which also is a story of radical Ubuntu, right? Is there something we can draw from that in thinking about your ending, the way that you end your presentation?
First of all, thank you to everyone for tonight and the space, and thank you to you, Mepumla. I very much appreciate just the invitation to be here because, of course, and we spoke about this, that intergenerational dialogue is really important. I think one of the great disservices of the born free discourse in this country, and really in it's very much a settler colonial discourse, both in Zimbabwe, South Africa. We have this discourse of born free, people so-called born free from history. And part of why writing These Bones Will Rise Again, a second book was really important is in thinking about what is the intergenerational ethic that guided Chimurenga, what is the intergenerational ethic that guided revolution, that is never the task of only one generation to do any work, that you have all kinds of traits that are brought in from each generation. It's quite important. And that doesn't mean that it's going to be a kumbaya moment necessarily, but there is a way of understanding that everybody has a part to play. We're going to have disagreement, we're going to have discourse, but that's a really important aspect, and that's something that I very much value, is having that intergenerational dialogue, and the fact that, again, it is not lost on me being able to be in conversation with you as a Black woman who has done this work that allows the likes of myself to be able to come in. So thank you again for your work and what you've opened with this, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this conversation. There's so much in the cry, because that is such an important motif throughout a lot of our intellectual production. And what I want to also just say, when we talk about intellectual, I hate that term organic intellectual, because I don't know what that means. Others are inorganic, others, or I don't know. I don't know what that means. I understand where it's coming from, but I think it does us a disservice in understanding who thinks and who doesn't think. Some thoughts must be qualified by vernacular, organic, etc., etc. And in particular for the work that I do, which, yes, I work on the archive. People always think about the text as the key marker, writing as the key marker of reason in particular. So it means that everything that our forebears were doing was not thinking until they started holding a pen. And so that is something that I'm always quite intentional about, even though I do work with a particular kind of archive, is to say that the archive, the written archive, and the pen is only one technology that we're using, right? It's only one technology of intellect. It does not mean that there's oral intellectual tradition and whatnot. And I'm saying this to say that across all of these traditions that I work on, in various archives, oral, so-called textual, and all of that, the central motif around the cry, whether it is Xhosa-speaking intellectuals crying out, ilizwe lifile, and I also move beyond just calling it a cry, it is the understanding that it's also a declaration, a structural diagnosis of a world being fundamentally destroyed by the onslaught of slaver, settler colonialism in this country, but also in the world, that they've always understood that this is something that fundamentally renames or reorders the world. Long before Adam Smith, for example, long before Hannah Arendt, they've always thought about what is the origins or what is the rupture that creates this world. And that cry, you often hear it. I mean, as we played some jazz music earlier on, the reason why I chose Busi Mhlongo in Tlisan Moya is that particular sound of Black women, and that's really important. But also Black men cry too. I also don't want to make this as a sort of pathologizing Black men. I think about Hugh Masekela in my favorite version of Stimela. And my favorite part where he says, and he always talk Bakalela Bocheri, you know that part, right? And I thought, wow, and it's interesting that you say Bocheri, right? You didn't say they are women, abafazi, you said Bocheri, right? Like, you know, it's speaking to the sort of romantic life, the love, the interpersonal that is fundamentally, that this structure, I mean, Stimela is about that mining compound, that slave mining compound, which destroys our family structures. And Hugh Masekela speaks about Bakalela, he's talking about their children, they're crying for their children, they're crying for their mothers, they're crying for Bocheri, they want to also have time with their wives. And then you have people like Helen Ziller who then tell us that, you know, Black men, they don't want to be fathers, you know, Black families don't have fathers. You know, it's such a fundamental violence to not understand where does that come from. When you're speaking to, and I know it's not answering your question directly, but just thinking about the cry and thinking about the structural and how then it suffuses us at the interpersonal level, Black men, Black women, and how that informs how gender works in this country, whether it's understanding the gender-based violence that is so rampant. You can't remove it from the violence that begins in 1652 to 1441. That violence is absolutely essential in understanding how this country works. And this is what the cry is always something that I'm always thinking about, is that cry, the deep existential anguish when you wonder, this country is one of the wealthiest countries on the continent, and yet people say, but why the violence? But people are saying it every single day. If you think the archive is only the textual archive, if you listen to people, if you watch shows like Kumbule Kaya, for example, grown men are crying for their fathers, for their mothers. That is part of the violence. And so when we're thinking about repair, it is a huge historical task beyond just, okay, there's a check, here you go. This is why that when we go back to that cry, those mothers are crying, it is that sense, that understanding that something fundamental here has been ruptured, it is broken, and it will be broken for many generations. And I think that's really important. And it can sound incredibly overwhelming. It is, and that's sometimes why our artistic traditions are the only ones that can capture it at that level. But part of then, for me, I'm always interested in what is the world's end. I refuse to believe that this is the sum total of what is possible for being. And so for me, it's not scary to think about the world's end, because again, if you pay attention to many of our traditions, Black peoples are constantly talking about the end. Ilizo lifile, the world is dead. You can think about the Sokoyan or the zombie. People are speaking about the death-dealing depredations of racialized chattel enslavement, but they're talking and theorizing. This is not just, again, folklore and that sort of thing. It is a very serious intellectual intervention into understanding what is the nature of the world. And so for me, when we're thinking about that cry, when we're thinking about the world's end, for me, that's an opening to think beyond, because again, when we talk about Ubuntu as intergenerational being, for us, death is not the end. Death is part of a transition to another state. And so for me, in that way, just like when there's a burning, a fire, and of course there's destruction there, but there's also an opening. I often think about, for example, the burning of the Cape Town Library, and of course people are going to think, oh, what is she saying? You don't burn libraries, etc., etc. But that moment was quite important because I've often thought about what is the place of fire and burning in many of our political traditions. So, for example, I remember meeting, if you've ever met Patisa Nyati, those of you from Zimbabwe might know Patisa Nyati, yes, exactly. And it was many years ago in a museum, funny enough. It was actually at the National Galleries of Zimbabwe in Bulawayo. And I was talking about, Indlovukazi Lozikeyi Dlodlo. And people were like, why are you using the colonial archive only? And at the time, I didn't have the answer. I was like, well, that's what's there. But he stood up and he, helped me answer. He's like, well, how many of you have actually ever held or seen Iwisa Lenkosi? And people were like, oh, you won't. He's like, yeah, you won't, because it's in the British Museum. And that's where it is. And the reason it is because when the kings at the time, when they came with the British South Africa Company, they actually decided to burn the capital, right? And so I thought, okay, maybe at that time that was because he was burning in response to, say, the colonial conquest. But in many conversations that I would have with Patisa Nyati, I realized that, well, actually, this is part of a longer tradition of burning, that you would burn a capital every time there's a new leader, or perhaps when there's the exhaustion of soil, you move to a new capital and you burn the old capital. And I thought, wow, that's a fundamentally different relation to materiality. You don't always need permanence. An end can be a new beginning. All right, and so that really freed me as someone who's a perennial hoarder to think, actually, what happens when you let go? How does that actually free you? I'll end on this in particular. My favorite line one of my favorite lines from Toni Morrison is in Song of Solomon, where she speaks about the idea, and I'm paraphrasing here, about in order to be free, you need to let go. Then you can really ride the wave. And I think that's really important for us. We're talking about waters as well, we're talking about fire, but what happens when we allow ourselves to see the end in order to see a new beginning? And so that's why it's not always scary for me entirely to talk about the world's end, to talk about death, because I'm thinking from a different metaphysical world that does not see death as the be-all and end-all. Rather, death is a beginning and an opening and a portal into new life.
And the challenge is always, what is this new imagination, right? What form of new imaginations?
But also we're impatient. People are like, yeah, we need to know today. It's like, no, be patient, be humble. And I think that's the biggest thing as well, is that humility to say, we don't know what we don't know. And again, learning from many of our best traditions, like the jazz, the improvisatory ethic, is to go with the spirit. You know, when it's always interesting when you see what is the mark of a truly brilliant performance. When do you most feel moved? It is usually the moment where the person puts the paper down. I mean, everybody's talking about Michael Jackson right now, and you have to think about, well, what is it that was really genius? There's a moment in which, yes, there's mastery of all the traditions, but there's a moment in which you can see the person is now being led by the Spirit. And I think that's part of it, is to say there's this desire to see the full plan ahead. And of course, this is not abdicating the work, no. But it's also saying the humility and to allow yourself to be guided by and to work through and to see as and when the moments come in, what can be possible when you decide that this is not going to be the be-all and end-all. What we've rehearsed, what we've been taught for the last 600 years does not need to be the map and the manual. What can we do and what can we allow ourselves to be when we let go of that manual?
Well, thank you so much. I just want to make sure that we know where we are going this time. This time, this is important. Is it what, how much time do we have for the 15 minutes? 20 minutes.
Let's decolonize
let's
time.
play by ear. Let's open it up, but we know that there are people who probably have other meetings. We will not feel offended. Thank you very much, really.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We had acknowledged the rectorate being here, and it's always such a privilege for us for every occasion to have rectorate. There is Professor Ronel Retief here, who was not mentioned. There is Dr. Leslie Van Roy somewhere here, and I'm sure there are some at the back, but I mentioned this to know that, for you to know that there's others who are accompanying the rector.
Thank you.
And that is important for this process. So I would like to invite questions, and I see excited smiles here in the front. People are eager to ask questions. I mean, these are some of the AVREC senior M students who are, some of them are working with motherhood. I hear a whistle there, which is very nice. So, he already has a mic, wow.
Can I ask this? So I'm not going to look at who's asking, but let me just say this, because years ago I would do talk radio, and they would always, and we had a Black Women's magazine, and every time, no matter what, to see how public spaces are constituted, it was always interested that even if you're talking about women's things or whatever, it was always men, and they were the ones who always talk. So. No, that's something, I'm not looking at who it is so that no one, I'm not predetermining. I'm just wanting us to say that it is also being aware of how public space is constituted. So, especially for women or people who are non-binary who might feel like, oh, I don't know if I can ask a question, ask that question. Men never think twice, they just put their hands up and just speak. So please, can you also, allow yourself, there's no silly question.
Is that man about to pass on the mic?
No, men are open, and like I said, we are interdependent society, but it's also to say that let us also think through some of the dynamics of public space, that's all.
That's wonderful, thank you. Okay, so we allowed it, because it comes from AVREC,
Yes,
so
okay.
we'll allow you to.
That was the heaviest 2 minutes of my life. But it's fine. Tinotenda Mzukurua Mbuya Lillian for this phenomenal work that you're doing outside, even outside of this. My question is simple, and I think there's something beautiful that you do in your work, right? Which I have constituted in my own language that I think that you do to what they have actually erroneously translated to proverbs, which I consider philosophical expositions. You do well with them, izicho. because you return them to their epistemological universe, right? Their epistemological and ontological universe. And so I wanted you to expand on that, on that tradition, right? On that insistence, not only as a borrowing that makes it nice, you know, sounds like some restaurant in Cape Town, but actually an epistemological standpoint and a way of holding us accountable to the Black radical tradition in the liturgy of engaging with Black radical thought. Thank you.
May I take a second? Because I just want to capitalize a lot. There's a question this side and... Oh,
Sorry, Prof,
okay.
can you use the mic, please?
Oh, sorry. Can you bring a mic to the front? We're gonna do left, right, man, female. So, non-binary. Please don't, Don't accuse me of being exclusionist.
Thank you. I think I'm being judged by my cover, but thank you so much. It's been really special to be able to listen to an author of this global caliber in my hometown. We really special event this. And thank you so much for putting These Bones Will Rise Again out into the world. I was deeply moved by it. I've been quoting it left, right, and center to everybody since then, hopefully not misquoting it. And I was incredibly touched by the way you spoke about waves there. So ironic that you just spoke about waves again, referring to Toni Morrison. And I thought that maybe the way that you spoke about time was a little bit in tension with a big statement about a possible end. And I think you might have put that to bed a little bit, but nevertheless, would you mind elaborating on your view of time as linear or not? Thank you.
So you saw this was actually 40 pages, and so there were so many things that I had to leave out. I really love your question, and thank you, I would just say, for that acknowledgement in the very beginning of my lineage. Very much appreciate that, because that is where I enter into this. I think language is so important. There's many levels and layers that I can answer that, and we can have, that's its own, this lecture for us. But really, and part of what I wanted to speak is, particularly when it comes to Ubuntu, there's two aspects of what I wanted to speak about, how the way in which the discourse of Ubuntu has been carried out in South Africa, particularly the post-apartheid discourse. We see there's a particular way in which, on one hand, it's dismissed as this thing that has no real rational grounding. It's just something that sort of nationalist elites use in the transition from white minority settler rule to black majority settler rule. And also just, I mean, we famously had one of our constitutional court judges saying Ubuntu is an I see it when I know it basis. And you even had Eusebius McKaiser, the late Eusebius McKaiser, famously saying that, you know, Ubuntu is whatever the judge has had for breakfast, right? This kind of non-rigorous way in which we deal with anything that happens to be African, right? It's just something that you can just say whatever, and you don't actually have to do the work for it. And so there's been a lot of scholarship, on the other hand, also around being critical of the professional discourse of Ubuntu, so-called professional philosophy, by the likes of Professor Mokgobe Ramose, for example, who criticized the fact that the discourse or the written and the professionalization of Ubuntu has been conducted by scholars who do not have proficiency in African languages. All right, and that's incredibly important, because the proficiency in African languages is not, it need not be a racial question. If you dare go and try and do Yoruba philosophy and you don't speak Yoruba, it would never happen. Not even to go there, if you do Greek philosophy, or rather if you do the classics, or you do continental philosophy and you don't speak the original language, it will be a joke. You could not, if you've never read the original. I remember, and I'll just park this here to say, I remember when we were 4 listeners at Chilumbembe, said, well, you haven't read Fanon in the French. And we thought, oh, he's just being elitist. But there is something to be said about reading the language in the original, because the language in and of itself carries the philosophical, the epistemic universe. All right, I was laughing earlier today. One of my favorite shows is Uthando Nesthembu. And so I was laughing about how, like, you know, especially Umabigos, those of you who know Mabigos, right? Matlele is always saying, Angwazi, I can't do that, right? Which is interesting because in English, if you were being flippant, and I'm saying this as a site of translation because I'm always watching a lot of how we do translation, even for people who know African languages. There's a very flippant way in which we translate our languages just to the English equivalent, for example. So you're watching Shlomu, the wife, or whatever, and, you know, all these gangsters are going into this thing, and they're saying, Yetlisan moya, or, you know, unesbinde, or whatever, that kind of thing. And they'll just translation to, you are brave, or you have guts, you have courage, or they'll translate Yetlisan moya to be calm. And I always feel like there's something lost when you do those kind of translations, because it's not just be calm, it's calm down your spirit. Which is another level to say that in the midst of this, you know, gangster whatnot happening, they're saying calm down your spirit. Even think about Busi Mhlongo, Itlisan Moya, put down your spirit. There's that kind of episteme that is operating there. So you are brave, Unesbindi, you have the liver, you have the goal. It is speaking to episteme of how people are thinking about this. And for me, when I even go back to these 19th century Xhosa intellectuals, they are incredibly particular about language. If you go through the many debates that they have about the ways in which the missionaries have messed up the orthography, the ways in which the missionaries are so-called standardizing Xhosa and taking one group of people's Xhosa and saying this is everybody's Xhosa, there's a lot of debates around that, and they are incredibly particular about how this language is being messed up by this process. And so that kind of particularity, I always think about Nzigo, for example, who wrote under the pen name Uhadi Waseluhlangeni, meaning the harp of the nation, the dove of the nation, rather. He speaks about the importance of language as holding the philosophical universe of a people. And so when they're doing these flippant translations, a lot is being missed. And so that's the ethos here, is taking seriously language as a site of theorizing, especially, so one, we can talk about the people who don't even speak African languages, that's a huge problem. But for ourselves, and we understand why, because we're always taught to make ourselves legible. That's part of what Mbiti is doing in making I am because we are. It's a way of making legible African philosophy, and that could be the editors. Many of us, when we know we're editing, they're saying, make this legible in terms that we would understand. That's the violence. We're constantly having to translate ourselves to be legible. And so my own translation philosophy, for example, I work with Sanele Kanjingana, for example, also Precious Dlamini, and we're working through all these archives, and we think about, okay, right, what does it mean to translate in the most literal way possible, to rather keep the idiom, to make it true to how people were speaking of the time, because how people write in 19th century is very different to how people speak now, because many of the idioms are very important. And with that in particular, when I was really looking at the 19th century discourse of Ubuntu and African philosophy, I recognized that many of the metaphors they were using, you cannot understand them without understanding the context with which they come out of. So for example, Imbumba, Yamamnyama, for example, that is a very specific idea, or let me use one that's easier to get. Ukuza kukanxele is a very specific idiom saying that it's to say, to wait for nlele, right, or makhanda, meaning something can be translated as something that will never happen, something that will take forever, and that's coming out of the specificity of the 9 wars of dispossession when Makhanda or Nlele was taken, right? So the point is that when you take seriously the languages, you're not just getting philosophy, you're getting history. That is what is lost when we just flippantly translate, whether it's on Uthando Nesthembu or when I'm now writing a philosophical tract, because I'm trying to be legible and we understand the conditions in which people were writing at the time. But for us at this moment, and again, we know what the difficulty is of having to translate and what it's like to make yourself legible, but I think we really have to have that agency to demand that I'm going to write it on its own terms and to take seriously and have a critical relationship to our own languages as a repository and a site. The last thing I want to say on this, to just as part of what has happened in the South African discourse of Ubuntu, those of you who've taken seriously that discourse, you see there's an article in the South African Journal of Philosophy which really is emblematic of how we don't take African languages and the archive seriously, is by Christian Gade, who is a Denmark-based scholar, and I'm only using him for us to understand how that particular work is saying that there's a 19th century discourse of Ubuntu, there's only 13 texts at the time, and guess what the methodology was? A Google book search. And that's not an indictment on him, that's also an indictment of the editors of the South African Journal of Philosophy to say, why did you not ask him in terms of his methodology? Why have you not read the African language newspapers? There are anthologies that are out. You can go to Book Lounge at Cape Town and you can get it. There's the Opland, the Jeff Opland Library, all of these anthologies of African language writing in the 19th century, and none of those were consulted. That's to speak of the fact that even when, and this is why I spoke about earlier, this false binary about textual or oral traditions, often the excuse about why we don't take seriously African intellectual traditions is to say, oh, they were not written. But in this case in South Africa has the world's oldest African language archive, starting with the Xhosa Press, right? And so the point is that it's there and you still don't use it. So it's telling us that the problem is not that we're writing or not writing, the problem is us. That you don't take black people seriously, whether they're writing or not. And that's the key aspect, is that we ourselves, we're not going to wait for our former colonizers to take us seriously. We are the ones who have to do that work of taking our languages seriously. To the second question about time. This is also something that I'd actually had addressed as well, but there was not time, ironically, to talk about time. And last week, as I mentioned, just because that was something that was much more fully developed, I did a lecture at SOAS on A Crime Does Not Rot, on Ijala Aliboli, and its specific ways in which it was systematically undermined and suppressed in the so-called codification of customary law, which I always say is different from umthetho. Customary law is a very different institution, just like chiefdom is not the same as ubukosi, right? Those are two different and historically specific institutions. And part of what is interesting there, again, in speaking and thinking about reparations, ultimately, I argue, is really, alongside this question of sovereignty, it is also a question of a struggle over time. Who gets to determine what time is? And here we're seeing with this clash over the suppression of Ijala Aliboli, and again, it takes 134 years across various statutes of limitations, various codes to suppress this, because it comes with, for example, the very first war, or rather the second war. We have Mania, who's going to Mnika, for example, and he's saying, well, you people have taken our cattle and that's why we had to wage war on you. And he's saying, but no, there was the previous war, but what you keep seeing each time, there's a sense of, no, this war is year zero, right? Part of the justification for each war is to say, don't talk about what happened in the past, we're talking about what you did yesterday, right? And so that kind of year zero at each point, even when you have people like Shepstone, for example, when he's now putting forth, he was the Natal Secretary for Native Affairs, he's now created so-called customary laws. And this is one of my favorite quotes. It's really terrible, but I love the fact that he says, these natives have memories as long as elephants. I'm quoting in verbatim here, right? And he's frustrated because it's clogging up, he says it's clogging up our courts. So he literally decides that any other crime before 1848, the annexation of Natal has been struck off the board. So these natives, in his language, who are talking about crimes from their grandfather's time, from Dingani's time, were not interested. This is now year zero. Think about the violence of that, right? So here we're seeing that for Western philosophy, there's a sense of this linearity of time. Time is a containment and an extinguisher of obligation. For African jurisprudence, again, because the conception of personhood is intergenerational, time is in fact a circular carrier of obligation until there's reparation. So it is two clashing philosophies of time that are coming together, a circular notion of time as well as a linear notion of time that's coming together. One of my favorite books in African studies is Keleto Atkins' book, The Moon is Dead, Give Us Our Money. And this idea, when she's translating the moon is dead, she's speaking about Ilanga, the moon is dead, so i.e. she's talking about lunar time, right? The sense that people historically, the time was according to nature, the cosmos. That is how time was understood, time was regulated, right? So there was not industrial time, which is also a very recent invention, particularly with the train, for example. That kind of motorized, industrialized way of time is completely foreign. And that book does a really great job of speaking to the kind of violence at a metaphysical level, but also speaking to what it meant economically, because the Africans were saying, the moon is dead, give us our money, i.e. this is the time we're talking to. And he's speaking about Gregorian calendar time. So that is part of the clash that we're seeing. When we say ilizwe lifile, it's saying an entire world and a cosmology and an understanding of the world has been ruptured by the encroachment of settler colonial capitalism.
You know, unfortunately, really, really so sad. We have, fortunately, we're gonna have conversations with the speaker after this. We are mingling, please stay behind. There is you will come and tell us what is happening. But they really, I mean, Panashe has very openly said to us she wants conversations after this. We usually have a private dinner for her, but this time, because she specifically asked for conversations, we are not having. She's going to be here. We are all remaining here. So please,
May I ask a
forgive
question?
us. Yes.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
So if we're here, and maybe we can say those who want to go
Right.
may be released, and those who need to go, not just want to, because otherwise people will feel obligated. Those who need to go,
Right.
And because I'm just saying that if there's no need for one person to colonize me if everybody's here.
Yeah, but you know, we don't want to colonize the waiters.
Yes,
of
that's
the-
what I'm saying. So that's the part I'm just trying to say, that if we're saying that we're still going to be here, how do we? I'm just trying to figure out what is also the most efficient.
We are going to be not sitting down in this space because
Oh, this space needs to be okay.
Right.
This is technical. Sorry for those people online,
Right,
but just trying to think
yes.
what is also the best
That's what
use as
it
opposed to
means.
one, where people are still here. That's my question.
yeah, no, it's a fair question. But you know, there's time is really the devil here, unfortunately.
It's Rhodes' time that we're working on.
Yeah, well, okay, so really, thank you so much. We
Thank
come
you.
to the transition, not the end. We've come to a transition where we will be in different space, but thank you so very much.
Thank you to everyone.
We really appreciate you, and I look forward to more conversations and perhaps to your coming back. By the way, Dr. Chigumazi is coming to AVREC. We didn't send out an advert for that, but those at AVREC, those of you who know where AVREC is, tomorrow at 10, is it 10 o'clock? 10 o'clock, yeah, please feel free to come. Our doors are always open, although it's supposed to be an in-house, but now it's going to be a little bit more open. We're opening the space. So thank you. Shall we give Dr. Chigumazi another applause?
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Diresh Ragjugamath, for hosting this event. We really appreciate you and the presence of your colleagues, Professor Ronel Retief and Dr. Van Roy at the back, and whoever else I didn't notice. But thank you very, very much to you all for gracing this event and making it such a wonderfully warm welcome for our speaker. Thank you so much. Someone is going to come.
Nkosi sikeleli Afrika, maluphakanyisu phondo layo, izwa imithandazo yethu. Nkosi sikelela thina lusapho lwayo. sedintwali matwenyeho murena buluka si chama sa Yesu ufedi sedintwali matwenyeho sibuluke usibuluke usibuluke morena usibuluke sichabasa Yesu sichabasa South Africa South Africa die blå van onze hemel die diepte van ons Heer word ons Heer gebergd is van die kranse antwoord sounds the call to come together and united we shall stand. Let us live and strive for freedom. In South Africa, our land. In South Africa, our land.
Can we give another round of applause to Amazink? What a beautiful rendition of our national anthem. And distinguished guests, they traveled all the way from Kayamandi. Let's give them a round of applause. So before we move to the courtyard, I have the privilege. Did I say who I was? My name is Crystal Peterson. I'm the marketing director. But before we move to the courtyard, I want to take a moment to give thanks. And this is, Prof. Pumla, not a formality, but a genuine act of acknowledgement to each and every person who made this evening possible. And I want to thank with our amazing speaker, Dr. Panashe Chigumatsi, for your scholarship, your courage, and your voice. Tonight, you did not only give us answers, you gave us something more, far more valuable, better questions. And thank you for trusting us with them. So I want to give you a small token of our appreciation. And this token includes a gift from somebody very special. The director of the Stellenbosch University Museum, Bongani Ngijimba. I think Dr. Zetu earlier referred to him as well. He's currently in the Eastern Cape to attend to a family matter. But he did say that about 4 years ago, you were a participant in the Stellenbosch University Museum Ubuntu Dialogue Seminar Program. And the output of this program is a book, Interdisciplinary Conversations Across Continents. And he asked me to hand over a copy of this book to you. So in addition to our token of appreciation from Stellenbosch University, the museum is also handing you over a copy of this book. Can you please come and receive it? Thank you. Then secondly, Prof. Pumla, there are no words to thank you, but we want to thank you for your work, the work that you do that help us understand memory and repair globally on the continent and in our own country. And your most recent award that Prof. Duresh also referred to earlier, awarded by our president, is testament to that. So thank you for holding the space with such grace. Thank you, Prof. Pumla. Then to our Rector and Vice Chancellor, Prof. Duresh, thank you for so eloquently welcoming us this evening and for hosting us at the Stellenbosch University Museum. Thank you so much, Prof. Then to the Center for the Study of Afterlife of Violence and the Reparative Quest, AVREC. Thank you for, under the leadership of Prof. Pumla, conceiving this lecture 8 years ago and for nurturing it into the platform it has become. We can truly say that this conversation exists because of you. So I want to say a special thank you to Sophia, and then Khonse, where are you? Who was part of the organizing committee. So I want to say thank you especially to Khonse and Sophia for helping us getting the show on the road here. Then to Dr. Zetu Mkize and the Center for the Advancement of Social Impact and Transformation, CACIT. They are our co-hosts and partners in crime and in convening this gathering. Thank you for your collaboration. It made this evening possible. And a sincere thanks to Shante, who could not be here this evening. Then to the Stellenbosch University Museum, another year for hosting us here. They open every year since the first year, Prof. Pumla, the extraordinary doors to us, and I can truly say that there is no more fitting setting for a conversation about history, memory, and justice than the Stellenbosch University Museum. Then we have new partners on board this year as well, and I hope Ellen Tice is online. She was going to be here, and she said she'll join us online. The Stellenbosch University Library and Information Services. They've curated a beautiful Africa Day exhibition to my left over there. And we invite you to browse through the Africa Day exhibition this evening. It consists of scholarly work around Ubuntu. And there's some articles, there's some books. There's books of Prof. Pumla and Panache over there. And to staff and students of the university, the exhibition will return to the library's Africana section on Friday. So you're more than welcome to go and visit it there. It will be on display until 30 June. Then Just Friends, our entertainment, they will entertain us after this session. They are so good, we're even thanking them in advance. So please go and enjoy them. And then last but not least, the team in corporate communication and marketing in the division of advancement, stakeholder engagement and communication, a whole mouthful. Who took the responsibility for the management of this evening, the brand, the marketing, the media liaison, the social media, and the live stream. Thank you for the amazing work you are largely doing behind the scenes. Then finally, to our student leaders and students who showed up, I even see some of our former student leaders here this evening, so this message applies to you as well. Your presence here is not ceremonial. Your voices are the reason conversations like this one matter. So the future of this continent belongs to you, and evenings like tonight are an act of faith, Prof. Pumla, in your generation. to our distinguished guests, colleagues, friends of Stellenbosch University, our community leaders, partners, those who have traveled here from far, and to those who joined us online from across the continent and around the world, your presence in itself is a statement. Thank you for making it. Sanibonani, we see you. So, in closing, I would like to invite you, we have refreshments on the other side, so you will have to enter the back area of the museum through those doors on my right-hand side. And as you go to the reception area where the catering will be provided, you will find a table with a notice like this, and there are cards there that you can fill out with instructions where we ask you, what does Ubuntu mean to you? So you can jot down a little memory, a line of poetry, a person who taught you, a word in your language, anything. And then you take that card and you hang it on the tree that is stationed right next to the table. So we will be using these cards as part of our exhibition in Atman B. So please enjoy the rest of the evening, travel home safely, and enjoy the catering. Thank you.